I got interested in this set of issues because I've been involved heavily in all the debates about drug access in developing countries, drug prices in Africa, the ties with patent law, all those debates. And I said, I want to, and I've also been long interested in technology transfer to developing countries. So I thought I would look at a different example and chose the example of vaccines, partly because it's absolutely crucial. I mean, in some senses, it's the most cost-effective and one of the most important medical interventions we have, and also because it interested me. And I will try to go through this relatively quickly to give you plenty of time for answer questions and follow in any particular directions you want to go. As I mentioned, one of my real interests is technology transfer. We're all sensitive to the extent to which there's a major debate, patents in developing countries, TRIPS, all these increased intellectual property protections in developing countries. Some people say they help technology transfer, and some people say they hurt. And my sense is, let's look at a few facts. Let's look at a few examples. And you may or may not know about the TRIPS treaty, but it imposes very serious restrictions requiring developing countries to have relatively strong intellectual property systems. So I went and looked at this and I had an opportunity to spend a year at NIH in Bethesda and thought I would take a real in-depth look, since a lot of resources are there, the FDA, a lot of the vaccine developers, and as well as all the library access and so forth, and found, if I looked back at vaccine technology transfer over the last 100 years in essence, it fell into 4 eras that overlap some. And in a quick sense, the heroic era was people going to developing countries, doing research as just small little teams, and producing things which you wouldn't want to put in your body, but nevertheless did make a significant difference for disease. Those institutions which were started early on turned into branches of national public health ministries, and during most of the 20th century stagnated fundamentally. They didn't get the money from their governments. Meanwhile, technology moved very rapidly in the developed world. Then, late in the last century, we began with a set of programs to vaccinate everybody. I'm sure you've all heard about the great smallpox eradication programs of the 1960s. These programs led to a global buying system in which there's essentially a single global buying entity that buys vaccines for all the world's children. I mean, 70 or 80% of them, roughly. So, a very interesting development as a matter of international law. And that entity has begun buying vaccines from developing country manufacturers. Then we have a new phase as everybody gets more interested in biotechnology. The technology changes. We have strategic alliances between major multinational firms, developing country entities, in a new different world at the tail end. Let me tell you just a little bit about this early world. Again, I'll try to keep it brief. The key point is Louis Pasteur, who was sort of the scientist and also the Bill Gates of his day. What he did was find a way to produce a vaccine for rabies, and then he raised a public subscription. In other words, he set up a private foundation in Paris with the idea that this foundation would be funded entirely by people sending in money out of altruistic instincts, because he had such a wonderful reputation. And they did, and it became probably the most important institution in the world from a vaccine perspective. To give you it developed rabies vaccine, and it then set up branches fundamentally all throughout the French Empire, all throughout the French colonies, but in a few other places as well. And there's now a network of 29 Pasteur Institutes. It essentially ran out of money sometime about the 1960s or 70s, so it gets a subvention from the French government, but still extremely important. Now, to give you just a sense of how important this is, the person who went and actually developed the vaccine that was used in much of the world against tuberculosis was trained at Pasteur Institute in Paris, and then went up and set up a Pasteur Institute in Saigon. The one in Dakar was set up to deal with yellow fever, and they developed a yellow fever vaccine. The person, Hafkin, who is a British scientist, he's a Russian scientist who was trained, who persuaded the British government to fund him, and set up an institute to study plague in Bombay. But he was trained at the Institut Pasteur. And Osvaldo Cruz, I will build on Brazil fairly heavily because we have pretty good data for Brazil. Osvaldo Cruz was a Brazilian doctor who went and studied at the Institut Pasteur in Paris, came back home and built an institute which is now Fiocruz and manufactures vaccines to this day. And if my slides work, we'll see some pictures of their facilities at different times. So this was a very different time from today. And indeed, one of the interesting points is a very significant fraction of the new vaccines at the time were developed in developing countries. You know, here we have typhoid trials in India, cholera, half keen in India, plague, half keen in Hong Kong, diphtheria in France, TB France, but with work in Saigon, yellow fever. The Rockefeller Foundation did work in Lagos in West Africa, and the Pasteur Institute did work in Dakar, and they did trials in Brazil. So this was a world which was very internationalized, and a world in which a significant chunk of the technical advances did, in fact, come in developing countries. To sort of try to suggest what was going on, there were at least three things happening. One is scientists had to go where the diseases were. I mean, to some extent, this is a description of the reality of scientific study. You didn't at the time have aircraft to bring deep frozen samples of live microorganisms from Asia to New York or London. There was obviously a heavy role for colonial policy. The French clearly viewed the Institut Pasteur branches throughout, particularly the French developing countries, the French colonies, as part of their colonial policy, and these institutes had close ties with the French army. And then there was obviously public health interest. I mean, I chose Brazil as the more sophisticated developing nation. It's just amazing how much interest it had early on. And, at the time, it was essentially, scientifically similar to many of what were the developed countries of the day. Production was easy. I'll show you an example in just a minute if my picture comes through. And you could get the technology for personal study. Yes, here's an example of the production. This is probably making smallpox vaccine, and you'll see why you don't want to put this in your body. This poor animal has been shaved on one side, infected with smallpox. It's a cowpox, smallpox. In other words, it's a cow species, cow variety animal, cow, goat, a number of options. Infected. That infection is allowed to last several days until there's a pus all over the skin. They scrape off the pus, which is what's going on here, and strain it, and that's your vaccine. Okay? You can see why, I think I took that vaccine made that way as a child. Hopefully under somewhat better conditions than this. But it gives you a sense of the conditions at the time and a sense of how transferable the technology was. All right, move to phase two. We have new vaccines, we have new technologies, and now, I do this talk for both scientists and lawyers. We also critically have new regulations, which are an important part of what's going on. I won't linger on the new vaccines, but note, you're all familiar with these. These are the list of vaccines you or your children take, and you had as a child. And every one of them was developed in the developed world. Every one was developed in the United States or Western Europe. So the old days of some kind of developing country leadership, or at least leadership within this network that included the developing world, that was gone. We had new technologies. You saw this animal technology that really is a little frightening. Viruses have to grow on living cells. So they found a way that they could take the living cells in an egg and infect that with virus and culture things. Clearly, you may still worry about it. And by the way, that's still the way flu vaccine, influenza vaccine is made. But nevertheless, it is certainly much more sterile, shall we say, than the way that cow was treated. We learned how to do tissue culture. You do the same thing, only you have a big vat in which everything is growing. We learned how to use biotechnology, the same biotechnology that we used to produce particular proteins for therapeutic purposes, like Genentech's tissue plasminogen, gene activase, or 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 tissue Amgen's epoetin. We use that to produce the parts of a bug that trigger an antigenic reaction, and so we can produce a vaccine, in essence, as a group of relatively pure chemicals, rather than as a living organism which is going to have any kind of impurities in it. We learned the conjugate vaccines are ways to put sugars and antigens together and make it much more effective. And along with that, there are obviously improved methods of separating, filtering, because you clearly are still going to end up with some kind of goo that has the vaccine in it and the residue of the organisms in which the vaccine was growing. We have many new ways of separating those, and we have better assays. I mean, one of the obvious problems you have to remember in this context is, how in the world do I know that this batch of vaccine is any good? I don't want to test it on a child. Sometimes I can test it on a mouse or a monkey or some other animal, and that has been a very traditional way. Clearly, we are happier if we can find a way to make that into a sophisticated laboratory test. So you can see an enormous advance of the technology beyond that poor cow. The advance in the regulation is probably at least as severe. And I should tell you, because it's really the background of the Food and Drug Administration Act, I should tell you about Jim. Jim was a horse in St. Louis. Well, actually, I'm not sure he was in St. Louis. Jim was a horse in the United States. And at the time, they made an antigen for diphtheria, somewhat the same kind of process you saw with that animal, only the animal gets sick and they take out the blood serum and then they extract the active agent from the blood serum. All right. They didn't have very good veterinarians, I guess. And not only did Jim have the diphtheria that he was supposed to have, that he has been given, but Jim also had tetanus. Just 14 St. Louis school children died. And the political furor led to the creation of what ultimately became the Food and Drug Administration in terms of its medical context. The Cutter incident in 1955 was another one in the United States in which one of the first batches of the new polio vaccine was inadequately inactivated, so it transmitted a little bit of polio with it. All right, and so that led to the creation of the Division of Biologic Standards, which in fact was initially in NIH and then later transferred over to FDA. Now, obviously, these things happened all over the world. Louis Hafkeen had a similar incident with respect to his plague vaccine in India, in which the plague vaccine was a bacterial vaccine, one bottle, probably not his fault, probably the way it was treated by a doctor at the point where it was used, one bottle was contaminated with tetanus. And again, a fair number of Indian young people died. So these early incidents led us to decide we need serious regulation. And this regulation is gone way beyond the kind of regulation which we use for drug manufacturing. And that's one of the interesting things. I must admit, it's something I'm trying to learn a good chunk more about. One way it has gone beyond is GMP. Now, well, I should say this is used everywhere, but it's more extreme in vaccine manufacture. GMP is good manufacturing practices. And the Food and Drug Administration requires that you follow good manufacturing practices. Now, what does that mean? It means, obviously, I don't let my things be contaminated in my vats, but it also means that if I'm going to use distilled water, for example, that water better have been distilled in a place which can document the degree of sterility and the way it was distilled. And for every other ingredient, I'm going to have a whole chain of paper demonstrating that every component of this product was made in ways that lived up to these particular standards. You can imagine how much paper is involved. Then add to that the kinds of things which we have learned to do more recently. Today, we build vaccine plants. I had the privilege of touring one of the Merck plants as part of my project, and they manage the air pressure. They are very proud of the fourth floor, which is nothing but a batch of air pumps, dozens of enormous air pumps, so that here's the room that the vaccine is being manufactured in. Out here is an area in lower pressure, so that if there's any leakage of air, it goes from out of the room, it goes from in the room to out and protects the purity of the vaccine. Incidentally, one of the ways you tell the difference between a vaccine plant and a biological warfare plant is whether you keep the air going in or keep the air going out. All right, now just kind of suggest one of the interesting issues. And needless to say, the FDA has gotten more and more complicated. Team biologics, fundamentally, what it has concluded is to use their jargon, which I must admit I don't believe, we need to engineer the quality into the vaccine. In other words, not take a process in which we don't care about the process, as it is somewhat the case with drugs, but we look at the final product and we make sure that it's adequately pure and adequately efficacious. Rather, they want to make sure that every part of the manufacturing process is documented and controlled, and this is one of the reasons that expenses are increased. Team biologic is, in fact, a way of putting together their scientific people together with their enforcement people who come around and look and see what's going on. Now so we have in the developed world new vaccines, new technologies, new regulations. What happens in the developing world? Well, one major thing is World War II. Just consider the extent to which this made vaccine much more interesting, for example, for the number of military uses which were used, for example, in the South Pacific. But then, right after World War II, came independence in the 1960s. And all of a sudden, these Institut Pasteurs, which had been built 50 years earlier, were branches of local public health ministries. And remember what's happened to developing country budgets. They didn't have that many resources. Later on, although I'm still trying to document what's really happening, later on the International Monetary Fund says, don't spend too much money on health, spend it on, this, that, and the other thing. And so not surprisingly, these entities pretty much stagnated. And to give you a sense of how bad it was, take West Africa. Under French control, yellow fever was wiped out in West Africa. Everybody was vaccinated. Independence came. The countries didn't have the budgets to do it. Yellow fever returned in West Africa. So, it gives you a sense of the change. And obviously also, what did we do? We built NIH. Europeans built MRC, the Medical Research Council. We had all these institutions to do research and to support research in universities. How many developing countries had any of that? And the answer, of course, is essentially zero until, maybe about the 1980s. A few of the leading developing countries, and I've mentioned Brazil, China, and India, began doing that. All right, so the basic, just to give you a sense of how long this pattern lasts, rabies, still produced the way Louis Pasteur had produced it, meaning you give an animal rabies, you cut out its spinal column, you let that spinal column dry, which stresses the bacteria and changes it. Then you use that to get another animal sick. And after you go through about 10 passages this way, you have something which you can put in human beings. All right. And I've heard pictures of people with rubber gloves, chopping the heads off mice as part of making rabies vaccine, within the last 25 years. Needless to say, there were frequently good manufacturing practice problems in terms of the quality of production. The most advanced vaccines were not made in the developing world. And if we want, I'll go into the oral polio versus inactivated polio vaccine. But, nevertheless, the point is clear. The system was not that good. And indeed, Brazil was the major exception. And here's my second picture for you. Note the change from 50 years earlier. We have clothing to protect the purity of the vaccine. We have work with the embryos of eggs. We obviously have a significantly higher level of sterility, and at the same time, it is still, in many respects, a rather primitive kind of vaccine production. The implications of this, here's the statistics. DTP is the standard diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis coverage of vaccines that, sort of the very, very basic vaccines. In 1980, now that's just 25 years ago, even the industrialized countries had only 60% coverage. Brazil and Argentina did pretty well. The Mideast did pretty well. Everywhere else in the world, no more than 1 in 20 children was vaccinated. That suggests what pressure there must have been on the budgets of these public health agencies. All right. And how did they get their technology? As best I can tell, and it's hard to tell, and I'm going to send out a questionnaire before I try to publish this, as best I can tell, obviously you still had people coming to the Institut Pasteur or its equivalents in the United States and Europe. You must have had a number of significant international meetings, and certainly some people studying abroad and going back home. But fundamentally, the technology didn't evolve that fast. And later in the period, the financial donors, the aid community, the assistance community, began trying to help. To give you a sense just of, work through the rigmarole, RIVM, and I couldn't possibly pronounce the real words, is the Dutch Vaccine Manufacturing Agency. Vaxera is the Egyptian one. So the Dutch helped the Egyptians. CIDA is the Canadian International Development Authority. CONOT is a Canadian vaccine manufacturer now bought by Pasteur. UNICEF, etc., AID. We helped Pakistan I think it's Nigeria, but I'm not positive of that. My mistake there. The Danes, Staten Serum Institute, helped the Iranians, Razi. Canada helped Nigeria. The Netherlands helped Biopharma, which is the Indonesian vaccine company, which is no surprise because, after all, Indonesia had been a Dutch colony. And so you see those patterns remaining. And the World Bank had a program in China in the mid-1990s and has told me they will never do it again. All right, so that's how we got the transfer of technology 2 generations later. Now let's get to today's world. And today's world begins with these programs to eradicate smallpox. PAHO is the Pan American Health Organization. We eradicated things typically in the Western Hemisphere before we did in the rest of the world. The Western Hemisphere has significantly better health ministries than most of the rest of the developing world had. And so that PAHO has been remarkably successful, and you can see it's essentially 10 to 20 years ahead of the World Health Organization dealing with smallpox, and it also was the predecessor of the polio. We still have this campaign when we're trying to wipe out polio, which hasn't succeeded completely. Now, those campaigns which will eradicate specific diseases, which were eradicable, it obviously depends a lot on the way the disease is transmitted and everything. Then we introduced a series of acronyms. EPI is the Expanded Program of Immunization. And this was basically a judgment by the world's health leaders that said we were successful in eliminating smallpox. Why don't we get all the kids vaccinated in the world? And build the institutions to do that. It was done in part, not completely, within the aegis of the World Health Organization. It was done with all kinds of problems. The Children's Vaccine Initiative, CVI, was a program designed to produce better vaccines, produce more science and do it better. And all the names had to change in the year 2000 when Bill Gates came up with the money and created the new institution, Gavi. I always have trouble with the acronym. It's the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, I believe it is. But essentially, this reflects the fact that now, sitting on the effective board of these entities, which used to be World Health Organization, a few major donor nations, US, UK, Europe and so forth, World Bank, UNICEF, which we'll come to in a moment, and the Rockefeller Foundation. I now also have sitting on the board the Gates Foundation. Fundamentally, these are heavily organized by the donors themselves. And those institutions in which there are international organizations and sovereign states and nonprofit organizations, all as members, have their own interesting issues from a international law perspective. But what is most important at this time is that UNICEF, this United Nations Children's Fund, and you see the funding appeals every Christmas, UNICEF said, we are going to undertake to pay for the vaccines for the kids of the world. Now, the Rotary Foundation is also involved, PAHO is involved, but fundamentally they decided, and we'll see the next slide gives me let me just skip this to save time. To give you a sense of the UNICEF system works, and then I'll go into a bit more detail. Now, it produces 70% by dose of the children's vaccines. Now, what's it trying to do? It is trying to say, developed world vaccine manufacturers, you have excess capacity. You have to amortize your research costs, and you have to amortize your plant costs, by charging the U.S. and European consumer lots of money. But once you've amortized those costs, it costs you almost next to nothing to produce a batch more doses for the developing world. So the standard immunization package, which, the basic childhood vaccines, that costs you a couple of $100s in the United States, is distributed throughout the world by UNICEF to the poor kids in the world for $2. The factor is just about 100. So they get the marginal cost vaccines at about 1% of the cost. All right, now that obviously has some implications for the vaccine manufacturer. At some point you run out of excess capacity. And moreover, don't forget that this whole last generation has been marked by people leaving the vaccine industry. My second bullet point, 10 out of 14 developed world manufacturers partly or totally stopped production of vaccines during the last, within the last decade. I mean, this is one of the reasons that the flu vaccine issue is so complex, is that there's so few manufacturers. Why did they get out? They got out because of low profits. They got out in some cases because of increased liability requirements, and they got out in some cases because the increased Food and Drug Administration regulatory standards made it significantly more expensive to produce the product. This put pressure on UNICEF because they weren't able to buy as big as a bit. They also did what they called the matrix in the early 90s. And this was a study that said, well, let's go around the world and see how vaccines are actually made. And see, the matrix is actually a chart which takes the size of a country in one dimension and the per capita income in the other dimension and then plots it. But the real point is the easy point. There's no sense in having a very small country making its own vaccines. No, they aren't going to live up to good manufacturing practices. It's hyper inefficient. There's a lot of economies of scale. So we are going, and of course, how much they really pushed, we don't know. But in essence, a lot of developing country manufacturers were urged to go out of business. And a few in the bigger countries, and with greater likelihood of producing high-quality products, were urged to stay in business. We're talking, UNICEF was in a real sense the world's vaccine czar, and Gavi has undertaken that role today. And then we add to that, the World Health Organization developed a pre-qualification system. But assume an Indian vaccine manufacturer. All right, if the Indians want to use that vaccine on Indian children, that's their business, taking sort of the standard international pattern. I have some questions with that, but nonetheless, that's sort of the standard assumption. And certainly the working assumption that the World Health Organization has to use. On the other hand, if UNICEF is going to buy that Indian vaccine and use it in Thailand, it better be good. It better satisfy some kind of standard. And so the World Health Organization set up a process by which they would review the quality control process of India and the quality control process of the particular Indian manufacturer and tell UNICEF it's okay to buy that vaccine. And so that's what the pre-qualification system is. By the way, in the drug context, there is the same kind of thing, the same kind of pre-qualification process for the Indian producing an antiretroviral to be used in Africa or used in some of the various global anti-HIV programs and producing a generic copy of the US version. All right, so World Health Organization developed that system. By now, 2/3 of those vaccines that UNICEF buys are coming from developing world manufacturers. And so where are they? You know very well. I mean, I'll give you the list in a couple of minutes. But you know very well where they're going to be. They're going to be in India, which has the scientific skill. They're going to be in Brazil. There are going to be a couple other special cases, Indonesia. And we still globally get yellow fever vaccine from Dakar, from Senegal and West Africa, although in ways that I have not yet been able to learn the details of, the basic quality control was done by the French. Colonialism survives in some sense. All right, so then, obviously, this has completely changed the economics of the industry. Contemporary, I think I want to emphasize 3 kinds of new issues. Patents move in. You haven't heard me talk about patents before, but all of a sudden, they begin mattering. Biotechnology happens, and everybody wants biotechnology. It's wondrous. And then we have this move, which follows on, really on Reagan and Thatcher starting in the 1980s, this move to encourage privatization everywhere. It's a political and economic thrust throughout the world. To show you what's happened to the technology, this is the technology we're talking about now. That's not very different from that's in Rio de Janeiro. It's not very different from what you'll find in New Jersey. So, clearly the technology has changed. And the same companies make it, and they supply the technologies throughout the world. All right. Let me talk just a little bit. Let me deal with the patent issues for just a moment, because I imagine they're especially interesting to you. The patent issues are quite different from what they are for pharmaceuticals or from what you may generally think of as patent questions. The real barrier to entry in this industry is the regulatory structure. The real reason there isn't a competitor for Merck isn't because of Merck's patent on certain particular products, isn't because of Merck's patents on those products, although in some cases it's getting them, and that's becoming a more important reason. The real reason is the cost in order to produce the facility, get regulatory approval, and then have half the market just isn't appealing. So in some sense, the cost of regulatory approval become the real barrier of entry that enable Merck to charge more than its marginal cost and recoup the capital construction and the research to produce the new products. The patents end up being used primarily on components. Adjuvants are things you take together with the vaccine to make it more effective, particular molecules, particular processes. And to test this out, I looked at all the appellate litigation involving vaccines that I could find. And you can see it goes back to 1999. That's all the cases there are. And what are they about? A process for growing and isolating a virus, a method of detecting an antigen, pertussis is whooping cough, a method of injecting a vaccine into an egg, a purification process. The only one which is in fact on a vaccine at all is this fourth litigation. In general, this is almost entirely an issue of the methods of production and intellectual property control of particular methods rather than intellectual property control of the end products. Obviously, that has very significant implications for the way the industry works. I will skip a little bit about public-private partnerships and the emerging private sector just to save time, but if you're interested, we can get into questions on it. But let me just talk about the other major themes, the other major theme, which is privatization. Why do we want to privatize these entities that were sitting in the public health ministries? Well, for one thing, because the World Bank and the United States government is telling us to. For another thing, because we need to pay higher salaries if we're going to get good people. I mean, basically, these institutions in some cases have been, obviously in some cases, have been stagnating for a century. In other cases, like Brazil, have done pretty well at keeping up. And they need greater management flexibility than they're going to get with the government. So this process began as early as the 1970s, clearly how you privatize, how much you privatize, who really takes over control, how much control the government retains and all that. These are very, these depend on the fine print. But it's obviously happening, and just to give you two examples, there's, Egypt doing it in a couple of phases and Indonesia doing it in 1997. I have another couple of things going on which I think have really changed in the last decade. One is, or we'll go back 2 decades on it. One is everybody says biotechnology is wonderful. I mean, it's a romance glamour industry. It is in India, just as it is in the United States. So India in the start, I think in the 1970s, developed a Department of Biotechnology, and needless to say, one of its efforts was to encourage India to develop a vaccine industry. Cuba took a major leadership issue in this. Fidel Castro saw a particular, I believe there was a particular epidemic in which vaccine supply was in trouble. He said, let us develop a cutting-edge biotechnology group in Havana, and they did, and we'll come back to that. So that I have government support for biotechnology in some of the developing countries as a new factor, and then I have the private sector issue. All of a sudden, India, as we now know what looks like Silicon Valley in the electronics industry, it began to look like Silicon Valley a little bit in the biotechnology industry. And my favorite example is Bharat Biotech. Here is a guy, Krishna Ella, an Indian, who went to the University of Wisconsin, found a more efficient way to produce a certain vaccine. Did he sell it to U.S. pharmaceutical company? No. He went home and founded a startup on it. And it's today become one of the more important companies. All right, so, a new process has emerged during this period. I also have let me skip this again. I also have alliances with the private sector. And I thought I would show you, here are the 5 companies which actually supply, developing world companies, that actually supply vaccines to UNICEF, in other words, to the world, not to the United States, but to much of the rest of the world, and where they get their technology. Biopharma, the Indonesian company, Dutch and Japanese governments. Fiocruz, which has been the source of most of these pictures, and has an alliance with Glaxo. GSK, Institut Pasteur, French inputs. Serum Institute of India, alliance with SmithKline Beecham, which is now Glaxo. It now gets technology from NIH. Shanta Biotechnology in India, it collaborates with Indian research laboratories to get its technology. Where does it get its financial support? Oman. Okay. You can get a sense of the way the world has changed over this last 10 years or so. And just to give you a sense, so I don't slight anybody, to give you a sense of a couple of the other, some of the other leading companies, Butantan in Brazil is in essence the Sao Paulo analog of Fiocruz in Rio de Janeiro. China is something I've been able to understand very little about, but there are 4 leading vaccine manufacturing centers in China. This Centro de Immunologico, something of that type, in Cuba is producing things, and it's WHO pre-qualified. Instituto Finlay is a second institution in Cuba, and then there's the Bharat in India, which I mentioned. It isn't yet a UNICEF supplier. All right, so these are sort of the developing world vaccine companies of the future. I want to note, let me skip this. I want to know what the next step might be. Is the next step, let me give you a couple of the hints in the wind as to the next steps that are coming, and then sort of speculate as to further next steps. One is GSK goes to Cuba. Note, this isn't GSK licensing technology to Cuba. This is GSK licensing technology from Cuba. Castro's program was successful enough that, and I should say in significant collaboration with the University of Ottawa, obviously it's trickier in the United States given all the embargo rules, in cooperation with the University of Ottawa, Castro developed or the Cuban Institute developed a technology which they are licensing to Glaxo and which Glaxo is using in the rest of the world. Brunner Biotech is a Swiss vaccine company. It purchased a Korean vaccine company as kind of, sort of regular in the course of business. We didn't talk about Korea earlier. Obviously, Korea is somewhere in between the developing and the developed world. But it is interesting when you see a major global firm not just buying somebody in Europe or California, but buying someone in Korea. Major change. And Wyeth is asked Bharat in India to manufacture one of its technologies, Haemophilus influenza B, manufacture one of its vaccines on license. It is not yet doing that for export to the United States. In other words, none of those companies that I've described to you have satisfied FDA standards, but they have satisfied WHO standards and are exporting vaccines to the rest of the country, and presumably then Bharat is Wyeth's, shall we say, manufacturer offshore production for Asia, for Wyeth products in Asia is fundamentally what's going to happen. Now, that hasn't yet happened. That's going to be its offshore production facility for manufactured products in the United States. That obviously could come. And to give you, just a couple of other things that might conceivably come, at what point is GSK going to buy one of these Indian companies, or vice versa? In other words, we are seeing the globalization of this industry in a new phase, and that would be sort of my 5th phase, the future. I don't think I will take the time to walk through all this. I think probably be better to shift to questions. But I've essentially attempted to show you what the field we walk through, talking separately about the technology, the economics, the politics, the regulation, the law, and the technology transfer processes over the periods, and sort of give you some thinking about the future. Why don't I open it up to questions at that point? Sure.
So you're pretty much saying like the U.S. companies aren't in the vaccines game, so they're not really making any vaccines. Is that because of like the money's not there, or is it just there's too many regulations, or is it both of them?
Well, let me not go quite as far as you summarized me. Because what's happened is the number of U.S. companies has radically shrunk. And in some cases, there's only one manufacturer for a particular U.S. vaccine. In a few cases, there's two. The reasons are we push the prices down. You know, one of the things I haven't told you, I described you the system for setting the global price, and clearly UNICEF, which now accepts it as a bidding process, isn't going to pay any more than it has to, which means prices are going to be pushed down and just makes it a less happy investment opportunity. The U.S. government buys a significant percentage of U.S. childhood vaccines and distributes them through various programs. And the U.S. government imposes some of the same kinds of price restrictions so that the profit level is low. The market is, by pharmaceutical industry standards, quite small. You're talking, for a blockbuster drug, you like to have sales in the billions. Now, for a vaccine, how many kids in the United States are born each year? What, a couple million, maybe? And if I'm going to get $100 per each for a vaccine, that's a couple hundred million. That's not a very big and very appealing product. So I have that, and then I have the increase in costs due to increased regulatory standards, which is one of the reasons the Europeans have not been coming into the U.S. market. So all of these things have led the U.S. industry to shrink. Clearly, in some way, because we're describing an industry which is driven by the need to produce a small quantity of product by pharmaceutical industry standards for global use once. I mean, you get one dose. Ideally, you get one dose of a particular vaccine in your lifetime, which makes you an unappealing market. You want to keep it as cheap as possible because, at least as far as I can see, Gavi is not going to get out of the business of paying for a developing country vaccine for kids. I mean, Thailand will graduate and pay its own, and maybe it already has. But no, Gavi is going to be paying for vaccines for Africa, for Haiti, etc., for generations. And so the donors are going to do it, and there's never enough donor money. So I'm going to have the same kinds of price pressures, and I'm going to have the same economy of scale issues. And I would like to see my Indian companies and my Cuban companies and so forth, I'd like to see them do research and invest, as well as invest in new production facilities. So I think the incentives towards global shrinking of the number of companies, I think that's going to be global. And obviously also these companies are going to have to raise their GMP standards if they're ever going to enter the U.S. market. One story I didn't mention to you is in China, the companies are, essentially the public health service of China is the buyer. And it won't pay enough that the companies can live up to GMP. And therefore the quality of the vaccine, the kids are the real losers, of course, but the quality of the vaccine isn't as high as it could be. And needless to say, that leaves that market in bad shape. So I think these same pressures that are pushed towards agglomeration and concentration in the developed world are going to act globally over the next decade or so. Sure.
You had a list of current litigation going on
Mm-hmm.
regarding patents.
Mm-hmm.
And you did mention that most of them were on production methods.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how they know that they infringe on production methods?
I've wondered the same thing myself. I would assume that either there's telltale markings, traces in the final product, or there's enough rumor within the public about what enough rumor within the community about what other companies are doing. I would assume it's one of those two mechanisms. Yeah. And in at least one case, and I should add, these aren't. You notice I didn't emphasize it. A number of those were veterinary medicine cases, veterinary products, and and a vaccine for animals is biologically essentially the same as one for human beings. Your regulatory protections against entry are much weaker in the veterinary area, so you're more likely to use patents there. Yeah.
You talked about kind of privatization going on in some places, and then later, recently, some acquisitions going on with larger companies
Mm-hmm.
producing vaccines.
Well, I think the economics that has changed is for the developing countries. In other words, the shrinking so far is in the developed world. The sudden blossoming is in the developing countries where they had a chance because UNICEF wasn't able to get as low a price as it wanted from primarily the European manufacturers, and therefore was willing to turn to these developing world manufacturers, and it became, in essence, a global public health service buyer. It provided a market. I mean, I think some of these companies are certainly selling to the Indian government as well, for example, but a major chunk of their market is precisely to UNICEF, and UNICEF is willing to buy this generation of vaccines from anyone it can, as long as they satisfy the quality standards that the World Health Organization.
Order of magnitude of what UNICEF's spending on vaccines?
I should have that number in the back of my mind, and I don't. I think we are talking about several 100 million doses a year at a couple of dollars each on the average. So we're talking probably in the low billions. But that's, I'm calculating, I should know the number and don't. Sure.
Do you think that what they've done with vaccines in terms of having the vaccine czar and then getting these vaccines out globally and putting that kind of price pressure on the manufacturers, why haven't they done that with drugs, with small molecules?
That's a very good question. I think the main reason is you have the generic drug mechanism available for drugs, which you don't have available for vaccines. As you know, arguably you have it in the sense that these Indian manufacturers and so forth are generic manufacturers of some of the vaccines which are made in the U.S. and Europe. But there is, for example, before the Food and Drug Administration, there is no formal generic approval pathway. As before the Food and Drug Administration, when the patent runs out on a drug, I can make an application. I can say, here's my product, here's how it's made, here's how biologically it is equivalent to the product that's already on the market, and I can get my product on the market in competition without doing all the clinical trials that make it so expensive to get a product to the market in drugs. There is no such mechanism in vaccines, which I think is another part of why I feel that the regulatory mechanism is the real entry barrier in the United States and Europe, or at least in the United States. So I assume that's the main reason. The second reason might be that it's getting a little bit more cynical. The number of pharmaceutical companies, the interest of this market to the pharmaceutical companies is pretty limited. You practically have to coach them to serve it. And there's a global public health buyer. So I have a monopsonous purchaser in large part, UNICEF. Whereas in pharmaceuticals, although we have essentially monopsonous purchasers within Europe and to some extent in the United States, in the developing world, in large, it's private purchasers rather than public health service. And so all kinds of different pricing becomes appealing. So I think there's a lot of differences between the two.
And also maybe because, again, the vaccine is a one-shot deal, whereas for any other drug, there's a long-term financial commitment.
I mean, that's why the market is so small. Yeah. Sure.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the decision of some countries to manufacture Tamiflu.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly it does something against the H5N1 bird flu virus, and they were going to go ahead and manufacture it without patent authorization from whoever owns the Tamiflu. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the patent implications of that. Are patents really hard to get these days, like in terms of authorizations and impeding this type of progress?
I can't tell you too much about the Tamiflu case, but I can tell you about the problem as a whole. I think the example I know best that raises the same issues is a Brazilian HIV case. And under traditional patent law, let's say, before the strengthening of the last generation, and before everybody was pushing the patent law to be like the United States' law, there was a compulsory license process, which was normally meant to say that if you're going to get a high price for your product in my country, you have to manufacture it in my country. And that obviously and quite reasonably and properly was shot down with TRIPS because that's hyper inefficiency. That's bad news. But nevertheless, the patents remained, and they were required to be reinforced under TRIPS in order to ensure, arguably, that the drug companies can get a monopoly right in particular countries for a particular period of time. Now, in order to cope with that and to make production possible for cases where the drug company was not offering reasonable prices, a good number of countries have a compulsory license process which is quite consistent with TRIPS and which says, under the appropriate findings and giving the drug company a chance to be heard and all that, I mean, there's obviously due process kinds of rules, and they're all written pretty much into TRIPS. Under the appropriate findings and appropriate process, if a manufacturer is not making a product available on a market in a reasonable way and public health is involved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then the country can itself make the product. And that's exactly what the Brazilians threatened to do. And of course, the moment you threaten to do that, the company reduces the price in most cases. So the typical operation of a compulsory license law is as a bargaining chip to force down a price. And everybody says, well, it never happens. And of course, it never happens. But if you give the country a club, the company will not go under. And in a few cases, you of course go through the whole process. And in at least a few, I gather that is what happened with Tamiflu. And in at least one of the antiretrovirals, one of the Brazilian public health-based laboratories produced the relevant product effectively in competition with the global company. And after they used the term break the patent, which doesn't strike me as a very good way to put it. I think the appropriate term is under a compulsory license and under a process in which you demonstrate the right needs and standards and obtain a compulsory license, and then the local company can manufacture the product in competition. Now, don't forget there's also some cases where the pharmaceutical industry hasn't applied for patents in particular areas. And there's also obviously, there are only some countries in the world which have the capability of manufacturing things. Other questions? No.
If there aren't any other questions, we'd like to thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Barton, for
Thank you. Good.